It's certainly not an easy subject, as Michael's chapter in his book is titled Murder, Self-Defense or Execution, the Dilemma of Assassination. Now, the problem is, what if targeted killing is actually all of these things? Even if it's not, does it really matter? I think it does matter, and I'm going to try and explain why. So let's start with the basics. There's a general prohibition on murder. Murder is something that is considered wrong, but that doesn't mean that all killing is considered to be murder. An individual acting in self-defense may kill an attacker, but as long as that was necessary and the force employed was not excessive in relation to the threat, that killing is not regarded as murder, although I do appreciate that the test will be applied rather differently in Texas than it might be in London. When one uses lethal force on behalf of the state or one's political community, that too is often not regarded as murder. That doesn't mean that all killing in war is justified, of course. It's still possible to commit murder within war. For example, deliberately targeting a surrendering combatant or deliberately targeting an innocent civilian. Both of these would be considered murder and a war crime. So can the War Convention accommodate targeted killing? What would it look like? And what would the implications potentially be? As we all know, the War Convention is a huge concept. It's a little hard to pin down. It's a complex set of articulated norms, customs, and codes. We do find a lot of it in positive international law, but because of the way that this gets determined and agreed, this is not the only place to look for it. And it's often professional soldiers who understand this best. For example, in the United Kingdom, it was telling that just in the last couple of weeks, it was the British military who were reluctant to directly target Gaddafi, even though the politicians were much happier to publicly consider this. This led to a very public and embarrassing split between the Chief of the Defence Staff, General Richards, and the Prime Minister, right at the very start of the Libya campaign. It was all smoothed out in the end, but the press enjoyed this immensely, as you can imagine. In a debate in June 2007, before the election, presidential candidate, as he was then, Obama was keen to distinguish between assassination and something called targeted killing in response to a question about pursuing US enemies into other people's countries. He stated, "I don't believe in assassinations, but Osama bin Laden has declared war on us, killed 3,000 people, and under existing law, including international law, when you've got a military target like bin Laden, you take him out. And if you've got 20 minutes, you do it swiftly and surely." Obviously, we don't do assassination. And for reasons that are often difficult to articulate, assassination evokes particular revulsion. But why should this be? What's actually wrong with assassination? Historically, there is a certain unease associated with the use of underhand tactics. After all, one chooses a victim rather than an adversary in an ambush or an assassination. Such qualms can be seen in the writings of Homer, Herodotus, and Thucydides. Euripides sums it up as, "A brave man thinks it unworthy to kill his enemy by stealth. He meets him face to face. Do not praise the clever spear of one who steals victory." Cicero records how the Roman Senate refused to countenance the assassination, or as they called it, killing in a criminal way, of even a powerful enemy, one who was waging war in an unprovoked way. Deuteronomy 27:24 states, "A curse on him who smiteth his neighbor in secret." Kant explains this attitude in practical terms in Perpetual Peace, where he argues that acts of hostility that make a mutual confidence impossible during a future time of peace, such as the use of assassins, poisonings, breach of surrender, and the instigation of treason, all of these things destroy the minimum level of trust required to achieve a stable peace at war's end. It's related reasoning that leads Professor Walter to argue that the killing of political leaders is ruled out in international law, even or especially in wartime, and ruled out for good reason, because it is the political leaders with whom we will one day have to negotiate the peace. Now, many find it one of the peculiarities of the War Convention that it is acceptable to kill thousands in a conventional conflict, but not just target, assassinate, execute, whatever you want to call it, the leader who sends them to war against you in the first place. However, Professor Walter does also suggest that there are obvious exceptions to this rule. No one, no moral person, would have objected to an Allied effort to assassinate Hitler. We were in fact not prepared to negotiate with him, but ordinary leaders are immune. Now, of course, there may be very real costs in allowing somebody to continue with their policies. The acts and omissions doctrine suggests that there is a moral difference between things you directly do and things that happen though you might have prevented them. Thus, the additional deaths caused by a tyrant are his responsibility, not ours, when we choose not to intervene. However, as David pointed out yesterday, it would seem that culpability can reside 100% on the side doing the action, and also you might still bear some responsibility for not preventing something that you could have stepped in and prevented. And when the acts are related to genocide, choosing to watch the perpetrator down the barrel of a gun without pulling the trigger would seem to be a stark test of this kind of moral choice. Now, if some of the critics of targeted killing are right, why not just be honest and bite the bullet? Just as not all killing is murder, perhaps not all assassinations are actually bad. In some situations, why not kill the tyrant? And why wouldn't you extend such reasoning to the terrorists who have killed civilians before and are planning to do it again? Because terrorists don't respect these rules anyway, that minimum level of trust is lacking from the start. That makes it easier, surely. Their lack of respect for the rules of war and therefore their lack of reciprocity from terrorists makes assassination a very tempting tool. But are these grounds sufficient for a norm? Because the cannibals eat missionaries, should the missionaries eat cannibals? Perhaps more satisfying justifications can be found in the existing principles of self-defense or protecting the innocent. So what does the law of armed conflict say on the matter? The British manual states that there is no rule dealing specifically with assassination, but the following rules would still be applicable. Whether or not the killing of a selected enemy individual is lawful depends on the circumstances of the case. So attacks may not be directed against civilians. Attacks must be limited to military objectives, including enemy combatants. Only combatants have the right to participate directly in hostilities. Enemy combatants may not be killed by resort to perfidy, i.e. the treachery, abuse, or the rules of war. And you can't put a bounty on an enemy's head. You can't say wanted dead or alive. But of course, all of this needs to be cross-referenced with a civilian is a non-combatant, protected from direct attack, and is to be protected against the dangers arising from military operations. He has no right to participate directly in hostilities. If he does so, he loses his immunity. And for those who support targeted killing, it is this last statement that's so important in differentiating it from other, perhaps illegitimate activities. So as long as you're not putting a price on someone's head or using treachery, you may target a specific combatant, but you can't target a civilian unless they've made themselves liable to attack through their actions. So this gives us two options. Stating that person X is a member of a group that we recognize as combatants and against whom we are at war would permit military action against that person at any time, in the same way that actions against any member of that group can be justified at any time. As long as no treachery is involved and other norms are applied, such as proportionality, military necessity, etc., such action would just be a standard military operation, not really targeted killing at all. A civilian planting an IED is obviously directly participating in hostilities and would therefore, arguably, you could just say, just join that group of combatants. Presumably, if his brother gives him a lift to do this, he too is directly participating. Therefore, they can both be considered combatants from now on. However, from now on, is this forever? If this is true, presumably the same applies to the husband in Nevada who gives his UAV operator wife a lift to the Air Force Base on the way to do the school run. Does he too become a combatant forever? Forever liable to be targeted at any time? Doing a neighborhood carpool with this man suddenly seems to be a very dangerous prospect. Just because he gave mum a lift once to work, where she was a combatant. This doesn't seem quite right, but there are also political and moral implications of labeling certain people into groups in this way. For example, the UK refused to legitimize the IRA by recognizing them as anything other than criminals. They did not want to dignify terrorists with the title combatant. It sounds like a very similar reasoning is being applied to the current inmates in Guantanamo Bay. And one can see why states might prefer a second option. Here we can act against a specific individual who poses a threat and therefore loses their protected status as a non-combatant. So here the man planting the ID is a civilian who loses his protected status while setting up the device, planting it, waiting for it to detonate, etc. His brother is liable to attack while acting as chauffeur. and can be also targeted at that time. By extension, the husband in Nevada can also be targeted while acting as chauffeur, but not once his wife is safely at work. Some suggest that targeted killing only really applies in this type of situation, and one definition that might be useful is provided by Georgetown law professor Gary Solis. To him, targeted killing is the intentional killing of a specific civilian or unlawful combatant who cannot reasonably be apprehended, who is taking a direct part in hostilities. The targeting is done at the direction of the state in the context of an international or non-international armed conflict. So it must take place during some kind of armed conflicts, otherwise it's just an act of homicide, and it requires very high-level authorization. So it's careful definitions such as this that attempt to make a clear distinction between targeted killing carrying out for the right reasons and acts of murder. So, for example, Amnesty International define extrajudicial execution as an unlawful and deliberate killing carried out by order of a government or with its acquiescence, reflecting a policy to eliminate individuals even though arrest is an option. Extrajudicial killing reflects a government's policy to kill the enemies of the state, not for operational or self-defense purposes, but as a means to punish opponents of the state. Thus, the death in London of former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, poisoned by a lethal dose of polonium-210, was clearly not a targeted killing, but appears to have been a case, allegedly, of extrajudicial execution. He was an outspoken critic of the Russian government and joins the long list of dissidents and journalists who have met grisly ends after alleging links between Putin's rise to power and FSB involvement in the Moscow apartment bombings, and amongst other things. Compare this to the killing of al-Zarqawi in Iraq in 2006, where 2 500-pound laser-guided bombs landed on his head in a safe house. 6 others died at in the same attack, but given the threat posed by Zarqawi, this was obviously considered a proportionate cost. This was targeted killing in self-defense. Therefore, the clear distinction is that the act is not punishment, not reprisal, but rather a preventative act taken in self-defense. Now, we've already heard at some length yesterday about some of the problems associated with the prevention of future threats. It's also easy to imagine how the imminence criteria required in self-defense might get gradually pushed further and further into the future due to the understandable fear of not acting in time and therefore being at least in part responsible for innocent deaths in a terrorist attack that might have been averted. So, for example, the type of reasoning that might happen is, he will plant the IED in the morning, so we must act now. He will give a lift to the UAV operator at the weekend, so we can target now, let's target now. He's planning something in the next couple of years. He did it once, we're sure he'll do it again. Also, we have to accept that the problem with any norm is that it doesn't just get used by nice people. Once we defend establishing a targeted killing norm, we imagine it being used for the world's benefit against someone like bin Laden or a high-level Hamas leader. We think of the nastiest individuals or regimes and think about how much better the world would look without these people doing harm. But if it's a norm for everyone. And there's no reason to suppose that the careful rules that Solis or anyone else proposes will not be abused by some actors claiming to be acting in self-defense. So, for example, Gaddafi claims the West are terrorists for our current actions against him. Robert Mugabe branded members of the international press as terrorists in November 2001, along with the entire opposition movement for democratic change, including 57 members of parliament. Police on the Nigerian Delta are known as kill and go by the local population due to their execution of anyone who is perceived to be a threat or obstacle to the corruption and flow of oil money. Legitimizing their actions by enabling them to call it targeted killing in defense of the state seems perverse. But let's face it, do we really care as long as no one's using it against us? Michael suggests that we might need to re-establish the norm against assassination or targeted killing if our opponents do generate the same kind of capabilities in the future. However, a norm that only works as long as the other side can't or won't adopt it doesn't seem to be a very sustainable one to me. Of course, it might be too late already. In the summer of 2006, Russian security forces were given the legal power to hunt down and kill terrorism suspects overseas if so ordered by the Russian president. Given that we keep our own safeguards and legal justifications for targeted killing secret, it's difficult to see how any other actor can live up to our expectations, even if they had any intention of doing so. Besides, we in the West don't really have a very good track record in this either. I'm fairly confident